Hey everybody, this is JJ here with another Mega Man Legends X update. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about the Zakobon rig and the Maya file. Essentially, I'll cover a little bit about the materials, I'll cover what the file actually has in it and how it works, and I will also provide this file in the description below on the video, so if you do want to play around with it, please do download and mess around with it. I'll provide the textures as well. Just so you know, this is a Maya 2020 file. It is a Maya ASCII, so you should be able to open it in older versions, but some stuff might break. Namely, the shader itself will probably break because Maya 2020 has a new surface shader that's actually really cool, and it's kind of a PBR-friendly shader, but it doesn't exist in prior versions, so you'll likely have issues in that regard. But just so you guys are aware, this scene file does have some lights in it. It also has a bunch of controls, and you can see right here, this is the Zakobon, and this is the Zakobon rig. And basically it's a very simple rig. It's probably one of the simpler ones aside from the snake in terms of what it's doing. It really isn't all that complicated. It probably could be better also, in particular the legs, but it gets the job done, and it lets us kind of do what we need to do with it, and I think that's just the point at this stage in the game. And basically we have our head control. You can rotate it around, you can stretch it up. He's got some guts on the inside here so that he has a little bit of a silhouette when you decide to use it, if you wanted to use it for animation. And generally speaking in Maya, if you're rigging stuff and you're new to it, you would want to take your NURBS curves here, your controllers, and you basically just zero out your transforms to bring it back to its rest state, which means you can work pretty quickly by just making sure that you know for a fact that all your transformations are frozen on these objects, and that'll help ensure that you're not running into any weirdness. And so for the legs, we have IK legs in this particular rig, so we get a little bit of animation for free. It'll lock itself to the floor, which is nice. There's also these curves down here, which are a little hard to see because they're colliding with the floor. But basically these operate to move the legs up and about, and you can kind of move them around and get them to do the sort of awkward steps that these creatures do. And again, this is probably, the legs probably could be a little better, but they are what they are. They also have a way to adjust the upper half of it, so you can pull it up and make quick adjustments if you need to while you're animating. There's also a master controller. This master controller moves the whole thing all around, but generally speaking, when you're rigging game characters, a lot of times you're not going to want to move the master controller. You're going to want to loop your animation. At the end of the day, when you export it, you'll want it to stay in the center so that way you can move it in world space in the game. So one of the things I've learned when building these characters for Unreal is that because they're robotic in nature and they have basically hard surfaces, they're not bendy, they don't have any deformation except for, of course, the innards, which does have deformation. You can see it stretch and stuff, but the rest of it does not. They're hard shells. They don't actually have any bending qualities to them. Because of that, they're much easier to weight paint as separate objects. But when you do that, you end up with multiple skin clusters, and skin clusters are basically weight information that is painted onto your objects, and it'll basically generate a skin cluster for every bound mesh. So when the mesh gets bound to the skeleton, you end up with like 15 or however many objects there are skin clusters, and that can be very detrimental to your performance in UE4. So the problem was, how do I get rid of those skin clusters? And actually what solution I came up with while doing this was simply to copy the weights of the skin cluster onto a copy of the object that's been merged all together. And by doing that, because they know their point count, you're able to copy those skin weights without any issues. And if there are any at all, you can basically just kind of go in and make a couple tweaks. You just test the mesh and make sure it all comes out clear. And it generally does. I was impressed with how accurate it was, even on stuff that's kind of colliding with itself a little bit in here. So that was a way to reduce the skin cluster amount and basically increase performance. And I've employed that throughout all of the different Zakobon, all the different Reaver bots we have. Now, one of the things I'd like to talk about too is I'd like to talk about scale. So while you're working in these projects, you definitely want to make sure you're getting the proper scale for these characters. I brought a unified like Mega Man character in here, and this character is essentially just like the Mega Man character as a black object, and it's just there for silhouette, and so I can see how his silhouette compares to the silhouette of the Zakobon. And generally, you know, okay, proportionally, are we in the ballpark? You know, is the Zakobon about this height, about this size compared to him? And this was measured against footage of the original game, just to make sure that we're in sort of the right ballpark in terms of proportions and size. And it's really important to make sure that you build everything to the proper scale, because when you bring it into Unreal, the last thing you want to do is scale everything to match a specific look that you're going for. Now, I've heard of different things, like sometimes working at scale can be hard to do because the objects are so large, in which case you could scale it and work at a fixed scale that's smaller and then bring it back up again. But ultimately, for things like characters or objects, individual props, you're going to want to make sure that your scale is accurate. And in my experience, I've never been in a situation where you need the scale to be anything but what it should be while you're working, because if you forget or whatever, then at some point, you know, your clients or your production team is going to be like, hey, nothing's lining up with their tracks or whatever they're doing. So it is very important to make sure your scale is accurate at all times. There is also some information I can show you with regard to the Hypershade, and this is basically where your materials live in Maya. And so essentially I've got two main materials that are being used for the Zakobon. I'll go ahead and disable curves. There we go. So basically I've got two materials going on. There's some other stuff up here, but that's not related to the Zakobon. I've got the main material here, which is the body, and then I've got this lens material, which is basically just the lens on the front here. And this shader is actually the surface shader for Maya 2020. It's pretty nice. It does a lot of PBR stuff, and I highly recommend using it. But if you do open this in a prior version, you'll likely break it. So I would just recommend using the PBR Stingray PBS shading, or maybe GLSL if you know how to manage shader effects. That works as well. Or the DirectX shader, you can try that. Or you could just pipe a lot of these just into the blend. You might not get exactly the same results, but you'll get close. And that's pretty much it for that. I can show you kind of what it's doing. There is a colored layered shader, which has the ambient occlusion and the color mixed in. The ambient occlusion is basically multiplied over the top at about 50%, just to give a little pop. You know, you can kind of see when you start reducing that, or adding to it, it can add or take away detail. And sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. I've found 50% to be a pretty good like foundation for most of my models, just to kind of give a little extra, you know, oomph to the visuals. And then I also have an emissive layered, which is piping in the emissive eyes and the butt down here on top of the color. And the color is basically over the top with an alpha of 0.25. So we're only really getting 25% of its contribution to the emissive. And this is essentially what makes it, you know, super bright or super dark. And obviously that doesn't look very cartoony. So we want to get something kind of in between, or something that feels a little brighter, a little more fun, and definitely a little more Mega Man. And that's basically it on how this works within Maya. I will provide these textures in the download link as well as this file. The last thing I'd like to show you in this character is basically the quick select set. So this is how you would get your character from Maya to Unreal Engine 4. And essentially what you would have to do, let me turn off those joints. Basically you go to select, quick select sets, Zakobon UE export. And what that does is it actually selects the binded joint chain as well as the geometry as one selection. And then you just go to File, Export Selection. I always go to Options, I don't really need to do that, but File, Export Selection, and then find a location for it. The easiest way I've learned how to do this after doing some of this project is to make yourself like a UE4 publish folder. And in there, you would build basically a character folder, and you would dump your characters in there as an FBX. Make sure that if you're sending out animation, you're going to want to go to the Bake Animation tab, or the Bake Animation group here. You want to check that on. Oh, sorry, you got to check on animation first, then Bake Animation, and then you just decide the length of it. You'll want to run it the full length of the animation, and you can tell Unreal to manage that. Also, if you know your model is being deformed or has skins, which ours does, you'll want to check deformed model to make sure that you get the blend shapes and skins as they come into Unreal. So that's about it. The last thing I could probably mention is these layers down here. You have the right and left controls. You can turn those on and off. And then you have the lights, which is basically just what I made for this presentation. And then you have the do not touch layer, which is essentially IK handles and other junk in your scene, group nodes, things like that, stuff you don't want to touch. You can mess with it if you like, but generally speaking, do not mess with this, because this is the guts of your rig, and they're not meant to be tampered with, really. And then you got the center rig controls. So that's pretty much it. So if we take a look at it without the NURBS curves and without the joints, there it is. There's our Zakobon. If you guys are so inclined, please download it and give it a shot. If you do have any questions for me, please leave them in the comments below, and I'd be happy to answer them as best as I know how. And I'd like to say thank you for everyone who's been supporting the project. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, all those good fun things. And I will talk to you guys next time.